Have you ever found yourself in a conversation with a family member that made you question everything you thought you knew about them? Well, that's exactly what happened to me not too long ago. I was sitting in my grandfather's old, creaky chair in his living room, you know, the kind that's clearly past its prime but that he refuses to part with because they just don't make them like this anymore. He was quiet, which wasn't out of the ordinary, but this time, his silence felt heavier, almost as if he was holding back something important. My grandfather and I had always been close. He was the kind of person you could confide in about anything, or so I had thought. But that day, something was different. He looked at me with a mix of hesitation and urgency, as though he had to share something but wasn't sure how I would react. After what felt like an eternity, he finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I need your help with something," he said, "but it's complicated." Over the years, I had heard plenty of stories from him, some wild, others hilarious, and a few downright unbelievable. But this? This was on a whole different level. Leaning in closer, I caught a faint whiff of the aftershave he'd worn for decades. "I need you to help me reconnect with someone from my past," he continued, his eyes darting away from mine. "Someone special." The way he said "special" sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just about an old friend or a war buddy, this was something far deeper, more personal. "Who is it?" I couldn't help but ask. He hesitated, his hands nervously fiddling with the edge of his sweater. "Her name is Evelyn," he finally said, his voice tinged with emotion. She was almost my everything. Almost. That one word lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. What could he possibly mean by almost? And just like that, I was pulled into a story that felt more like it belonged in a movie than in real life. My grandfather began to unravel a tale about a woman named Evelyn, whom he had met long before he married my grandmother. They had crossed paths during a time in his life when everything felt uncertain. Evelyn was bold, beautiful, and everything he thought he wanted. But life had other plans. Duty called, family obligations weighed him down, and he made the difficult choice to let her go, or so he told me. "But you don't just forget someone like Evelyn," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Not even after all these years." He confessed that they had recently reconnected, on social media, of all places. Can you imagine? My grandfather, the man who could barely navigate his smartphone, had somehow managed to find the woman he once called his almost. And now, he wanted my help. I was stunned. Was he really asking me to help him meet up with her? To do what? Rekindle something that was best left in the past. "It's not what you think," he quickly added, as if reading my thoughts. I just need closure. I need to see her, to talk to her, to know," his voice trailed off, but I knew what he was about to say, to know if he had made the right choice. I should have shut it down then and there. I should have told him this was a terrible idea. But the look in his eyes, a mix of hope and regret, made it impossible to refuse. "Fine," I said at last. "I'll help you. But you have to promise me one thing." "What's that?" he asked, leaning in. "Promise me this won't lead to something you'll regret." He nodded, but the way he said, "I promise," didn't sit right with me. And just like that, we were in it together. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The very next day, my grandfather was like a man possessed. He woke up earlier than usual, dressed in his Sunday best, and even took extra care polishing his shoes. I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. He was more excited about this than I'd ever seen him at family reunions or holidays. "So, what's the plan?" I asked, still skeptical about the whole thing. He handed me his phone. On the screen was Evelyn's profile picture. She had aged gracefully, but her eyes held a certain haunted quality, as though they carried stories no one else could ever truly know. "I sent her a message," he said. "She replied this morning." "She replied?" I asked, unable to hide my surprise. What did she say? She wants to meet, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Tomorrow. At the coffee shop near the park. This was moving faster than I'd anticipated, and I wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, I wanted to support him, he deserved closure if that's what he was seeking. But on the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a bad idea. You're really going to do this? I asked, trying to gauge how serious he was. I have to, he replied simply. It's now or never. And so, the next day, we found ourselves at the coffee shop. It was a quiet little place, tucked away from the city's noise and chaos. My grandfather had insisted I come along, not to interfere, but to provide moral support. Evelyn walked in, right on time. She wore a simple yet elegant outfit, and the moment she saw my grandfather, her face lit up in a way that made my stomach twist. Charles, she said softly, her voice heavy with decades of emotion. Evelyn, he replied, standing up to greet her. They embraced like old friends, but there was something deeper in the way they held on to each other, something unspoken. I sat at a nearby table, pretending to be absorbed in my phone, but I couldn't help overhearing their conversation. They talked about their families, their careers, and the directions their lives had taken. At first, it was all innocent enough. But then Evelyn said something that caught my attention. I've always wondered, she began hesitantly, what would have happened if we'd been braver? If we'd fought harder to be together? My grandfather didn't answer right away. He stared down at his coffee cup, his hands trembling slightly. I've wondered that too, he finally admitted. As their conversation progressed, the atmosphere began to shift. What started as a casual catch-up between old friends gradually turned into something deeper. Evelyn reached across the table, placing her hand gently over my grandfather's. It was a small, simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes. You were my greatest what if, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. My grandfather didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he leaned in closer, his gaze locked onto hers. I wanted to step in, to remind him of the promise he had made to me, but I couldn't move. It was as if I were frozen, torn between wanting to protect my grandmother's memory and understanding my grandfather's yearning for closure, or perhaps something more. As they continued talking, it became increasingly obvious that this wasn't just a trip down memory lane. There was an unspoken tension lingering between them, a bond that time and distance had never fully severed. Then, Evelyn broke the silence. There's something I need to tell you, she began. My grandfather's expression changed, curiosity mingling with apprehension. What is it? He asked. Before Evelyn could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, apologized, and stepped outside to take the call. Seizing the opportunity, I approached my grandfather and whispered, "What are you doing? This isn't closure, it's something else entirely." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he admitted. I thought seeing her would give me closure, but now, I don't even know what I'm looking for. When Evelyn returned, her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she tucked her phone into her bag. She avoided meeting my grandfather's eyes, which only heightened the tension in the room. Is everything all right? My grandfather asked gently. She nodded, though even she didn't seem convinced. It's nothing, she replied. Just, life catching up, I suppose. My grandfather studied her carefully, tilting his head. You were about to tell me something before the call. What was it? Evelyn hesitated, her gaze darting between him and the floor. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, I never told you the whole story about why I let you go back then. His brow furrowed. I thought it was because of my family. Because of everything happening in my life at the time. That was part of it, she admitted. But there's more. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. I found out I was pregnant, just before you left. Her words hit like a thunderclap. My grandfather's face went pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though he needed something to steady himself. Pregnant, he repeated, his voice barely audible. Yes, Evelyn said, her eyes welling with tears. But it wasn't yours. The weight of her confession hung in the air, suffocating. My grandfather looked as if the wind had been knocked out of him. I didn't know how to tell you, she continued. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought letting you go was the best thing for both of us. But I never stopped caring about you, Charles, not even for a single day. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stared at her, his face a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. Why now? He finally asked. Why are you telling me this after all these years? Because I couldn't carry this secret any longer, she said, her voice breaking. And because I needed you to know, letting you go was the hardest thing I've ever done. The emotional intensity was almost unbearable. I felt like an outsider intruding on a moment meant to remain private, yet I couldn't look away. My grandfather took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair as his hands trembled. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I don't even know how to feel. Evelyn reached for his hand again, but this time, he pulled away. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to hurt you. He shook his head, a bitter smile forming on his lips. Didn't mean to hurt me. Evelyn, you carried this secret for decades, and now you're dropping it on me like a bomb. What am I supposed to do with that? She had no answer, and the silence stretched on like an eternity. I just wanted you to know the truth, she finally said. I thought you deserved that much. Deserved, he echoed, disbelief lacing his voice. What I deserved was honesty, back then, not now. The silence between them was deafening. My grandfather stared at her, as if trying to solve a puzzle that no longer made sense. Finally, he muttered, I need some air, pushed his chair back, and walked out of the coffee shop. When I found him sitting on a nearby bench, his head was in his hands. You okay? I asked, sitting down beside him. I don't know, he admitted. I came here for closure, but instead, I feel like I've opened a door that should have stayed shut. Do you regret meeting her? I asked after a pause. He was silent for a long moment. No, he said finally. I needed to see her, to understand what we had, and what we didn't. But this wasn't what I expected. We sat in silence, watching the world go by. Eventually, he straightened up and said, I need to go back in there. I owe her that much. Back inside, Evelyn was still at the table, clutching her coffee cup. When we approached, she looked up, her eyes a mixture of hope and fear. Evelyn, my grandfather began, his voice steady but tinged with sadness, I appreciate you telling me the truth. But I think it's best if we leave the past where it belongs. Her face fell, though she nodded, as if expecting his response. I loved you, he continued. A part of me always will. But I made my choice all those years ago, and I can't change that now. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached for his hand one last time, and this time, he let her hold it. I wish you all the happiness in the world, she said, her voice trembling. And I wish you the same, he replied. As we left the coffee shop, my grandfather didn't look back. I could tell he was carrying a mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and maybe even peace. In the days that followed, he seemed lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. He never spoke about Evelyn again, and I didn't press him. Some doors, once closed, are better left that way. But every now and then, I'd catch him staring out the window with a faraway look in his eyes, and I knew he was thinking about her. About what could have been. About the choices we make, and the ones we live with.